and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This is Irreverent, Faith and Current Affairs.
Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Patrick Deneen, Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame, who is the author of the new book, Regime Change, Towards a Post-liberal Future. Now, this is a very, very exciting book, and I think Professor Deneen has been talking and writing about a most crucial subject, which a lot of people who listen to this podcast are interested in, even if they don't know it yet. So please stay tuned. If you don't know Professor Deneen and his work, you're going to find this very, very interesting. But first, if I can I call you Patrick? Is that okay? Or
that's fine. Sure.
Okay?
We Yanks are pretty informal. So, yeah.
Yeah, I thought you might be.
So I'm wearing a t-shirt. You're in the collar, so clearly we have.
Yeah, it's 2:10 here, and it's first thing in the morning where you are. So
right.
it's completely allowable. So thank you for joining us this time in the morning. Why don't you just introduce yourself, say a little bit about you, your work, the University of Notre Dame, and help us to understand where you're coming from, please.
Sure. Well, again, thank you for having me on. My name is Patrick Deneen. I am a professor of political science, but specifically political philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. Notre Dame is how we call it, but I love your French pronunciation. Yeah. I've taught at 3 different schools. My first position was at Princeton University as an assistant professor, and then spent about 8 years at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and decamped from the Imperial City for the heartland of the country in 2012. So we're located about 2 hours to the east of Chicago. And so we are kind of a small city in the midst of the cornfields, but a great university, and I think arguably the greatest Catholic university. I think, if not the world, certainly in America. Just in terms of its prestige, its the kind of faculty we gather, the students we have. And this was really for me, the main reason was to be a participant and hopefully to contribute to, I hope, the revival or a new launch, a new form, a kind of renaissance of Catholic higher education in the United States and beyond these borders. My previous work, I'll just mention briefly, I've worked in the classical political philosophy in my early work, and then worked on some kind of theological political thinking in a book called Democratic Faith, and then became somewhat famous or infamous, depending on how one views these things, with a book that was published in 2018 called Why Liberalism Failed, which I think it's been translated into 20 languages now, received a kind of very wide, a surprisingly widespread interest beyond the U.S. And then my kind of follow-up book to that is the recently published book, Regime Change. Regime Change,
yeah. It's available in hardback now in our country, and you can just get it anywhere. So I would recommend people go online or whatever and buy this book, because it's a brilliant book, which I just finished a couple of days ago. So listen, I think we should just get straight into this, because I feel like there's a whole worldview that needs to be challenged here, and I'm speaking specifically from a Christian perspective. In my notes that I've written to remind me of what to ask you, I've written at the top, please convert me fully to post-liberalism, because that's what I'm hoping that you're going to be able to do, because I feel like I've grown up in a world in which I've just been conditioned on some level to think of liberalism as the sort of default state of things. Like, this is just the way we are. We're a sort of free society where we have individuals who are all pursuing their own individual good. And if religion happens to be that good for some people, then that's okay. And this is the way it should be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when I read about post-liberalism, and I have to say I was very very convinced by your book. I feel like it's not only that I just need to be sort of deprogrammed intellectually, but it's that I need to be able to imagine what post-liberalism would look like as a reality in the world. Like, is a post-liberal order actually possible? But I think the first thing that we need to do is to take that first step and say, well, what is it about liberalism that is problematic? Because as you sort of imply there, when you're talking about your first or not your first book, but that book, that earlier book, Why Liberalism Failed, it sort of sounds like heresy, just the very title, liberalism failing, post-liberalism, what's all this talk about? What are you actually advocating here? So what exactly is the problem with liberalism?
Well, since I'm speaking to, I think, a probably more theologically informed audience, my usual route to tackling this question is to talk a little bit, or specifically about the kind of political world and the political form of liberalism. But let me take a step back and talk about, I think, the anthropological assumptions that inform liberalism. And when people hear liberalism, they tend to hear a lot of different things. It kind of depends on where you come from. But let me boil it down to two basic anthropological worldviews, both of which I think, I dare say, and I know your audience probably might lean a little more Protestant, but both which I think have roots in a certain Protestant strands of thinking.
Yeah.
The first of these is articulated in the kind of, the individualistic strand of Protestantism, which has its political form, which is the kind of social contract theory, that the basis of political order, or the basis of the theological order at some level, is ground in the individual conscience, the view that individuals are the kind of ground on which you build a political or a theological order. And I think one finds this especially in a kind of in an understanding that because anything that goes beyond the individual will start to be ordered around an idea of what that organization, that worldview, regards as the good, what it regards as the foundational good of the social and political order. And this becomes in the view of this strand of thinking, inevitably becomes kind of oppressive, because it involves the imposition of either power or norms. It might be just in the form of informal norms, but it might be in the outright form of law. And since human beings are fallible, and here you can see you move into a kind of Calvinist strain of thinking, since human beings are fallible, since we're corrupt, since we're fallen, we prefer to have a kind of a politics and a kind of theological approach, or an anthropological approach, that assumes that there's really there can be no really kind of robust understanding of what the good is around which we organize ourselves. Rather, to use the old political theorist Judah Sklar's view of things, we think about a liberalism of fear. Liberalism in which, and this is kind of a Hobbesian form of liberalism, or maybe a Lockean form of liberalism, in which liberalism is based not on what we think we might achieve through a kind of shared ideal of what the good looks like, but how we can organize ourselves to avoid great evils, how we can organize ourselves to avoid oppressions and cruelty and the kind of pain, the infliction of pain. So this is I think what we might describe as the kind of it forms the basis of the classical idea of classical liberalism, a kind of minimalist state, a state that kind of keeps us in order, doesn't impose a worldview. I think that's what you were describing in the beginning when you were describing the default liberalism. But there's another liberalism that I think when people hear this is what they think, and tends to be more the progressive idea of liberalism. This would be more the kind of 19th century Hegelian inflected or Kantian inflected, or in the U.S., someone like John Dewey, or I don't know if these figures are familiar to you over there, like Herbert Crowley and these folks, for whom human beings are, especially as historical creatures, are potentially perfectible, or we're more and more perfectible. We can become morally ever better in and through the process of history. So when some people hear the word liberalism, this is what they think, because this has become, for many, the description of what liberalism is, as opposed to what classical liberalism is often described in the U.S. context as conservatism. But what I want to really underscore is that both of these are variations of liberalism, which in some ways truncates a part of understanding of the human being. So the classical liberal tradition truncates the understanding of human beings as capable of being, as aspirationally capable of orienting themselves toward the good, toward a communal or political good, and ultimately the way in which that intersects with the divine good, and that plays a role in our social and political lives. The latter form, the kind of progressive liberalism, tends to truncate this more, let's say, Calvinist, or more the view of human beings as imperfect and as fallen, and so we'll often regard politics as the realm of salvation. And when one thinks today of the kind of trajectory of progressive liberalism and its kind of ferocious effort to sort of eliminate all injustices, all even thoughts that might run afoul of the progressive vision of human perfectibility, one sees the way in which this anthropology has deeply informed the kind of progressive liberal tradition. And so when I speak of liberalism, we tend to think of these things as oppositions, but I see these as really ultimately linked, precisely because they've truncated what I would regard as true aspect of the human person, as the human being. So a post-liberal future really talks, I think, or orients itself on a vision of a sort of a reintegrated human being, integrated in both our fallenness, but also our potential for a kind of saintliness, or a kind of, to be people who can be in the imitation of Christ, and that can inform our social and political order. Mm-hmm. And so I see that as an effort to push back against what we might think of as both right liberalism and left liberalism, and why it is that I think, arguments like these tend to get ferocious pushback equally from both of these sides. So just one example, this book was savagely reviewed in both the New York Times as the progressive liberal, but also the Wall Street Journal as the kind of classical liberal or conservative outlet. So not surprisingly, they see this as a kind of threat to their worldview.
Yeah. So here that would be like being savaged in The Guardian and The Telegraph or The Spectator or something like that. Right, and left publications. So I think that lots of people listening to this would be completely on board with you when you critique progressive liberalism as being about a kind of, it's this vision of human beings as, malleable, as perfectible, if only they're given the right sort of governance and direction and education and so on and so forth. I think lots and lots of people listening to this podcast would see that for what it is, and they'd be very, very suspicious of that and be absolutely on board with you critiquing that and saying that this is a truncated, this is an unrealistic, it's actually an unchristian view of what human beings actually are because of the problem of sin and fallenness. So I think there'd be no problem with that. I think the question people would have is around the thing about the critique of classical liberalism and the idea that the left is actually in secret, almost like a pact with the right, in order to promote an overall liberal worldview that actually has more in common. These two sides have more in common with each other than they really have differences at the bottom. So could you say a little bit more about that? So classical liberalism, and believe me, I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
No, it's fine. These are really important questions.
Yeah. So classical liberalism, we would be talking about freedom of conscience, freedom of religious association. We'd be talking about free markets and things like that. And as you say, based on the ultimately Christian idea, stemming from the civil war in this country, the 17th century, the wars of religion in Europe, the idea that human beings are basically fallen. We can't have there's no perfectible political order. So you have to have on some level, some kind of compromise whereby people
a modus vivendi.
A way of living. So what's wrong with that? What's the problem with that?
So, of course, that is you've articulated as well as anyone, the kind of classical liberal view, which appears entirely sensible on the surface. However, like many political philosophies in practice, it has rarely been seen anywhere. And in fact, what we do see is a kind of tight link between what we might think of as these opposites of classical liberalism and progressive liberalism. In some senses, you could say progressive liberalism is literally the project of the children of the classical liberals. And there's no better figure to look at for that than John Stuart Mill, who is literally the son of a certain kind of classical liberal, James Mill, a utilitarian, and someone a kind of an intellectual heir of the kind of Hobbesian tradition in which we can all just get along if we just seek to sort of give ourselves a society in which we maximize our physical pleasures, minimize our physical pains, And we don't have to agree on what gives us pleasure and what gives us pain. We just have to, kind of create the conditions where we can, if it's playing video games all day, that's fine. If it's, going to Stravinsky concerts, that's fine. Whatever it is that gives you pleasure, as long as no one is harmed in that activity. And that's the philosophy, you could say, that underscores the classical liberal tradition. John Stuart Mill really understands that this condition of being free to pursue your own ideas, your own vision of what constitutes what you think the good life is, requires not just the condition of political liberty, of a kind of, and you described some of those that exist in the classical liberal tradition. So liberty of worship and liberty of expression, liberty of speech. But it requires the conditions in which even the informal forms of, we could call them norms, he calls them culture, he calls it actually the custom, actually is the word. He calls it the despotism of custom. That even if you have, and this is the beginning of his great classic text on liberty, even if you have a society that's organized politically around these ideals, these classical liberal ideals of liberty, you're not genuinely free to pursue your version or your understanding of what freedom is and to act that way in the world until the kind of despotism of custom has also receded to the greatest possible extent. Well, what are the sources of the despotism of custom? Well, it's quite clear in Mill's view, the first and most threatening form of this despotism are the churches. It's religion, right? And no child chooses, right, what religion they're going to be raised in. You might choose when you become an adult, but as many sort of former practitioners of their religious traditions will tell you, being raised a Roman Catholic or being raised an Anglican, just messed me up psychologically. If I hadn't been raised in this crazy, oppressive worldview, I'd be a much better and happier person today. But it really messed me up. So Mill's worldview is one in which you not only have to create the political conditions of liberty, you have to create the social conditions of liberty. And this means you're going to have to begin to dismantle or redefine all of the institutions that you could say, are the bearers of custom in our respective societies. And of course, the other major source of this is the family. Now, what are the two forms of, we could say, cultural transmission that are today under, I would regard, and you might regard, as the most serious assault and attack by the progressive liberal onslaught? And I think those would have to be the family and religion. And they are, in other words, they are pursuing and rolling out the kind of logic inherent within the classical liberal tradition, which is it's not just about the freedom of organizations to do what they want to do. Ultimately, it has to be the freedom of individuals from those organizations. And only when one is perfectly free, kind of in a, you could say, a created condition of the state of nature, which has to be created, right? It's not in nature. There's no state of nature in nature. It has to be created in the political order. Only then can you make genuinely free choices as an individual about what, do I want to have a family? Do I want to practice a religion? But that has to come after having dismantled all those institutions as kind of bearers of these kind of cultural norms. And I think that's why we find this kind of ferocious battle. And this is why I think ultimately, and here's where, I have a lot of debates with my classical liberal friends, sometimes frenemies, which is that in their view, we can hold the line. Those people who want to worship and have free expression, we can hold the line if we look to someone like Mill and say, if we can all just get along if nobody is being harmed. Yeah, that's the line they want to hold. And my argument is that you're just sort of trying to defend yourself at step B, which is ultimately inevitably going to lead to step C, D, E, F. Yeah. And there's no holding the line at step C if you abandon the idea that there has to be some form of deeply shared cultural, political, and I think ultimately kind of metaphysical belief.
Yeah. And that links to something else I wanted to just draw out of this whole thing as well, because I was speaking earlier about being conditioned, or you might say brainwashed by the kind of liberal worldview. But one of the aspects I think of that conditioning is that it hides from you the fact that the liberal order does have, or does convey and enforce a vision of the good.
That's precisely right. And that was really the theme of my last book, Why Liberalism Failed. And for a lot of people who never had realized, I think this, at least those who work in the world of political theory, for many people this seems obvious, but it was for many people a revelation.
Well, it doesn't seem obvious to everyone living in this culture. They don't realize this. So I mean,
but that said, I think the more we see kind of the firm and sometimes oppressive hand of liberalism exercising its power and its force, whether it's through public or increasingly sort of private or semi-private institutions, I think the more people are willing to see, it actually has a very substantive conception of what it views to be the human good.
Yeah, absolutely. And would you say at bottom, the vision of the human good in liberalism, both on the right and the left, is really to do with individual freedom? So it's about being liberated completely as an individual, and this is why we need to undermine or dismantle these, dismantle the church, dismantle the family, and any power it has over the individual, because without these things you wouldn't achieve that metaphysical vision. Also interested to know what your view would be about things like transgenderism and transhumanism, because it seems to me that those things are kind of intensification of the same sort of
absolutely.
It's about freedom from your own body, freedom from your own gender or whatever. So
I think there's a of course the word liberalism has at its root word is liberal or liberty. It's to be free. I think there's a little bit of interesting slippage even within the liberal tradition, because within the liberal tradition, I think there's a way in which individual freedom it's an end, but it's also a means. Right. And it can be simultaneously both. I know this from Plato's Republic. There's an early part of that dialogue where Plato or Socrates clarifies there can be objects we pursue which are both ends and means. And so it's in a certain way you could say in a liberal order it certainly becomes a kind of end. In other words, it's the one thing we can all agree that we hold to be a political good and we hold to be a social good, that we should have the greatest degree of freedom possible. And we should actually support the greatest degree of freedom possible through arrangements of our economy and arrangements of our social order and arrangements of our education, but with a view that freedom is in itself good, but it's also a good that supports people's pursuit of their vision of the good, whether it's individual or within communities. And those communities might be religious communities. They might be, I live in South Bend, Indiana, which is a very kind of Catholic-y kind of place. So the community is very, informed by being around the University of Notre Dame. And I think the same is true for progressives, for whom liberty, and what I've just described as a kind of classical liberal view. It's true of progressives, but in a different way, that the liberation of individuals from all of those kinds of thick forms of membership that I was discussing that Mill thinks can be a real obstacle to our freedom, that once we're freed from those various obstacles, we actually when you read the work of many progressives, it's only at the point where we're freed from all of those partial forms of human association that we can see the genuine way that we human beings form a collective, that we are actually members of something that transcends any particularity. So I think at the deepest level, when you read, again, figures like Hegel or Kant, or in the more continental tradition, you encounter an argument that this form of individual freedom will ultimately elicit in a kind of new form of human membership in a kind of global, humanist, humanitarian vision of belonging and membership. But it eliminates all partiality. It eliminates all kind of sense of being bordered or bounded or separated or in some way, shape, or form, defined by something particular as opposed to universal. So here again, the liberty becomes, in the first instance, freedom from, but then ultimately sees itself as a kind of new kind of freedom. That's the human emancipation into the sort of global humanitarian order. And again, I think you see these worldviews manifest politically in the kind of two, at least in the United States and in Britain, the two parties.
Yeah. And presumably that sort of, global brotherhood of man thing, that manifests in globalist organizations.
Absolutely.
The EU, but presumably also in sort of military adventurism as well. I mean, I remember reading. I had Yoram Hazony on last year, and he was making a similar point about that. Do you see that? Do you see it in that way?
Well, I think both of these will have their military forms and their aggressive forms. But I think Yoram's correct that liberalism is ultimately in its progressive form. Liberalism is certainly a kind of imperialistic order. There's no way of sort of having a sense of boundedness or particularity. Yeah. So it will ultimately seek to kind of make itself universal. And part of that will be to overcome all national differences. And that can be done through the sort of soft hand of the market, the kind of, and this was, of course, the early vision of many liberals, Kant among them, was that the kind of market and free societies would be the best means of overcoming these kinds of particularity. But I do think when needed, it's also been more than willing to rely on hard power to expand itself. And that's certainly, I think, been one of the projects of the U.S. in the last 50 years. Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, and with the UK in largely in alliance and agreement with the US about some of the things that have been going on. Before we move on to the solution, as you see it, could you give? So I think some people might be listening to us talking and thinking, yeah, well, I'm following you, but and you're saying that there's this kind of this hidden vision of the common good, which is concealed by the liberal political philosophy, at least on some level, and maybe I've never thought about this before. Could you give some examples of how that might manifest itself in the world? Because many people in the UK, and I'm sure in the US, they're just going about their business. They're free to go to church if they want to. They're free to get married. Nobody's interfering with them. So what's the big deal? Even if there are politicians in Westminster who are all atheists and secularists, isn't this system kind of working all right? What's the problem here? So actually, you just mentioned one. This is the kind of extreme case, but it's a revealing case, and it's transhumanism, right? And transhumanism, for those of you, your listeners who are or may not be familiar with it, it's the view that human beings ultimately will and perhaps inevitably, will take over, in a sense, their own evolution. That we've relied, sort of unconsciously and sort of accidentally on the kind of Darwinian form of evolution that's given rise to a creature, us, who now have developed the mental and technological capabilities no longer to be subject to accidental evolution, other than the evolution that we ourselves propound and put forward. So that we might not regard, we may not realize it, but just very simple things like certain advances in health, right? Increase of our age, increase of our height, compared to our previous generations. These are various ways in which we've evolved ourselves by manipulation of our environment. We have a lot more protein in our diet, more calories in our diet. We have lots of ways in which we've improved our health, but ultimately this will go from being to what we might think of as relatively conventional forms that have always, human beings have always had to have some degree of nutrition, some degree of, thinking about their health, to ones that will become much more technological in the sense of beginning to manipulate our genetic code, beginning to splice other sort of genetic forms into the human DNA so that we can live underwater, we can live in outer space, we won't need oxygen in the same way anymore. There's lots of ways in which it gets sort of sci-fi, but there are people who are devoting a lot of thought and a lot of research and a lot of resources to these undertakings. Now, what's interesting is that transhumanism, on the one hand, stems from a deeply libertarian worldview. And so most of its proponents, if you look at their writings, they are actually deeply libertarian. So Elon Musk might be someone we might think of. In other words, people who often come from the kind of tech world, and they have this vision that if human beings could just be freed from the kind of restrictions and boundedness, not only of their political order, but of that million despotism of custom, religion that might give us some hesitancy about manipulating our genetic code and playing God, then we would have the real capability of perfecting ourselves. But notice how this shades also and ultimately becomes indistinguishable from a kind of progressive vision, which is we have the ability, or we hope we have the ability, and we are pursuing the vision of our ability to perfect ourselves, to make ourselves into a different creature, to make ourselves into basically to take over the work of God, to make ourselves into human gods, and have the ability, as someone like Francis Bacon envisioned all the way back in the 1600s to have the ability to reverse the conditions of the fall, he suggested would be ultimately the outcome of science. So this is one area we could talk about a lot more, but in which the liberation of the individual is on the one hand, it's the project of the classical liberal tradition, but shades easily in its practice and its effects and its trajectory into a kind of perfectionist project. And I think you can see a lot of ways, you can begin to see a lot of ways in which one would see this. So rather than thinking that you can draw a kind of stark line between these two visions of liberalism, these two sort of sides of liberalism, the two sides of the coin of liberalism, I think it's really necessary to see them as really ultimately bound up together and really as a kind of common, almost a kind of trajectory, a logical trajectory from one end to another. Yeah. I'll just mention one other thing. This is something that I was talking about in the last week at a program with a number of students. If one's language is primarily the language of liberty, which is the classical liberal tradition, the classical liberal tradition, and among other things, and again, you've already indicated this, sees liberty, at least in part, as a means to defending more traditional kinds of institutions, whether it's the family, religion, the churches, communities, and so forth. And yet, the language of liberty can't be contained. Yeah. Right. So how is it that, for example, we just had a landmark court case that overturned Roe versus Wade. Now we have a classical liberal tradition that has supported this, but has done so primarily through the language of freedom, primarily through the language of freedom for the last 50 years. Now, how do you combat a worldview that has embraced the vision of a limitless permission to abort one's children that has precisely adopted the language of freedom? That this is about the freedom of the individual to do with their body as they wish. Their body is, as John Locke says, my body is my property. Yeah. And I have a right to do with my body, right? He says, to dispose of my body as I wish. Yeah. Yeah, you're going to need different language to combat this. And the part of the problem of the liberal tradition is the only language it ultimately really has is the language of liberty and the language of individual liberty. And so it turns out that even if you can get Roe versus Wade overturned on something of a technicality in the constitutional legal tradition, which is to say the federal government shouldn't have been involved in this decision, it's a decision for the states. Now, what are we seeing? You're losing in a lot of these states, precisely because you haven't prepared the ground for the kinds of arguments you're going to need to make. Now, what's happening in these circles? Well, more and more classical liberals are arguing this is such a losing issue for us. We should leave it behind. Yeah. We should leave it behind.
So just to elaborate on that slightly. So the way I see what you're saying is you're essentially saying that you've almost got a clash of freedoms here. If you just argue along the kind of liberal lines, you'd say, well, from the progressive side, the pro-choice people would be saying, well, women should be free to do what they want with their own bodies. But then maybe the sort of more classically liberal inclined or conservative person might say, well, the child has a right to have the freedom to live, or to use that kind of rights, liberty, freedom language. So I think that's a good example of why you need to acknowledge that there's some kind of sacred order to the political dimension, to the political, because really what you need to be saying is, no, actually, human beings are made in the image of God, therefore they need to be protected by law from being killed, essentially.
That's right.
And that's the only real argument that you can use that will not be vulnerable to the progressive liberal critique, I think.
I think that's precisely right. And it was kind of if I may say, a kind of marriage of convenience in the U.S. of people who are more willing to make those substantive arguments based upon the inherent dignity of human beings, which generally came from church traditions, especially Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox Jews. And they combined forces politically with classical liberals. And this was a marriage of convenience, especially during the Cold War. There was a kind of common agreement that communism was the great threat, and we could overlook our differences in an effort to push back communism. And one of the most interesting things about our politics these days, it's, if you're looking at it maybe from England or from elsewhere on the continent, you might say that the biggest battles taking place in the sort of U.S. political arena are between the left, the kind of progressive liberal left, and the classical liberal right, or what we might call conservative in the latter case, and liberal or progressive liberal in the former case. But in fact, I think the most significant battles that are taking place are within both the left and the right today. And you have a kind of post-liberal left, which is, I think, increasingly looking to kind of a Marxist tradition as its lodestar. And you have a post-liberal right in various forms. And there you have a kind of mayhem, a kind of cacophony of voices, if one pays close attention. But here's where I think, and maybe this is where we move on to our discussion of what we do now. I think what you're seeing forming is a kind of our various post-liberal visions, one of which draws more substantively on a kind of Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. And so it's especially, I think, within Catholic thinkers, myself included, and one that draws on a much more Nietzschean tradition. And really sees this as the kind of a contestation that liberalism was a kind of effort to kind of, as Nietzsche argues, to institute a kind of slave morality. And the way to break free of liberalism will be for great, powerful, strong people to emerge and to exert their power. This is the kind of, I don't know if your readers or listeners are familiar with the kind of Bronze Age pervert, the BAP world. That's really becoming quite appealing, especially to a lot of younger men who feel like they've been sort of emasculated by a increasingly feminist-dominated order in which they've been raised.
Absolutely, people who would be attracted to people like Andrew Tate and to a certain
exactly,
people like that. Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
that's right.
Sure. Absolutely. So talk to us about this then. So you just mentioned something which is obviously a key thread in your book about this kind of Aristotelian Thomistic vision of the common good. So help us to understand what that is, and I'd be really interested if you could elaborate on this aspect of it being a sacral vision of society and what that might mean.
Well, of course, so Aristotle and of course Aquinas, where it's easier to talk about the sacral vision in the case of Aquinas. But they both shared, of course, Aquinas is deeply influenced by the rediscovery of Aristotle's writings. But they both hold that the aim and purpose of politics is to institute an order in which human beings are able to achieve their flourishing. Their eudaimonia is their telos, the human happiness, or we might describe that better as flourishing. And that these conditions of flourishing require a political order to be attentive to human nature, what it is that leads to human flourishing, which is, in Aristotle's view, a certain kind of ordering of the soul and a certain kind of ordering of the political order. And these two things are not separable. The ordering of the soul takes place in significant part through a good ordering of the political order. And the good political order is ordered so when you have a sufficient number of people who have well-ordered souls. So it's a kind of virtuous circle if you can create it, but it's very easily, or let's say it's very difficult to begin at some level, because you need sort of both at once, and it's almost impossible. So it requires a little bit of a miracle to institute, but you can get closer, would be Aristotle's claim. And for Aristotle, this is a kind of learning of virtue that's both at the level of the individual and at the level of the political order. And by learning of virtue, I mean, or what Aristotle means and Aquinas means, is that human beings are all born with a certain kind of capacity or a certain potential. And that potential is to be well-ordered, but it doesn't come from, we could say, nature alone. It doesn't come from just allowing people to do have a million no harm principle. In fact, that's harmful. In Aristotle's view, a no harm principle would be harmful, because it would basically say, as a society, as a political order, as a social order, we are officially indifferent to what you do, as long as you don't hurt yourself, as long as you don't hurt anyone else and potentially yourself. For Aristotle, this would be harmful because it would be indifferent to a basic necessity of human beings, which is to be raised well, formed well, and ultimately ordered well beyond the home in the political order itself. And this means a kind of political order that seeks to cultivate virtues just as much as it's hopefully attempted to do in the home. Now, this is where the classical liberal will bristle and say, well, this sounds oppressive to me. And this is where, if my argument is correct, you're going to live you're going to live in an order. You're going to live, in other words, you're going to live in a society that has certain deep commitments that shape you, whether you like it or not. Even a liberal order is not going to be ultimately indifferent. It's just going to it's going to insist that no one holds an Aristotelian view publicly. That's going to be the public view required of a liberal order. And in this view, I think it's an either or, that you either have a kind of more Aristotelian order or a more liberal order, but neither of them escapes from a kind of deep commitment to what it is we are going to share as human beings, as worldviews. So I guess just to begin with, just to place that as a kind of proposal, Aristotle's view would be that politics, society, even our economic order, our social order, has to be informed by a vision of the good. Now, in Aristotle's language, this is going to be defined really exclusively by an appeal to nature, human nature.
Yeah.
I mean, he does have a view of metaphysics, but it's less central to his argument at the political level. In Aquinas' view, this is going to be ultimately related to his understanding of human beings as creatures divinely created by God, and therefore there's no way to separate that final telos of human beings to become not just good political citizens, but ultimately citizens in the city of God. There's no way to really divide that, so that the political order is ultimately must be informed by that divine orientation, and therefore cannot be indifferent to that. Can't be indifferent to the sacral in the way in which I think liberalism has generally proposed that it must be.
Yeah, or even hostile to the notion.
Even, of course, increasingly hostile.
Yeah, increasingly hostile. And that kind of leads me, I mean, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I suppose I might ask the sort of practical question. It seems to me like the liberal project, I don't know whether I would say it's sort of breaking down or whether it's reaching its apotheosis, its kind of zenith. I'm not really sure which it is, but things appear to me to be accelerating quite significantly in terms of the globalist, transhumanist, the transgressive future, which appears to be opening up before us. Obviously, as followers of Christ, we're not anxious and we're not fearful, but at the same time, it looks pretty bleak and pretty dark to a lot of people.
Yeah, the book of Revelations is not a fun time to live in.
No, it's maybe an exciting time, but not necessarily very fun. So, and indeed, somebody who would hold a sort of premillennial view of that, the eschatological situation, it might sound somewhat of an irrelevance to be talking in this way, because really what we're looking at is a complete breakdown of the global order from a Christian sense, but in another sense, the sort of the apotheosis of it, the coming of the Antichrist, the globalist system, the mark of the beast, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying that's necessarily manifesting itself now, but if one is a premillennialist, that's pretty much where one sees things going. So, I mean, I guess my question is, what hope is there for a recovery of a kind of sacral vision of society? It sounds great. I'd love it to happen, but how could it happen given where we are?
So it's interesting. You describe our situation as one it's not clear whether the liberal order is falling apart or its apotheosis. And at least the argument of my last book was both can be true at once, in a sense, that the very success of this project, which is the sort of the effort to completely liberate all individuals from not only in this political sense of being the rights-bearing creatures, but to be freed increasingly from all of these sense of being in relationship with each other, as being formed in and through cultures and traditions and histories and families and generations of families. The more that becomes sort of the project, the success of this project, the more the project reveals its deep pathologies. And I think all the things that you mentioned, liberals would point to as their successes, and we would also see those simultaneously as pathologies. So both of these things can be true. So the most recent book is an effort to make the argument that we have been led by our elites, is the language that's used these days, our leadership, our whatever we want to call it, the ruling class. And here I'm really appealing to old Aristotelian and then later Thomistic categories, but this is just old political philosophy I'm trying to resurrect for our contemporary age. Every society has a ruling class. And that ruling class will have a set of priorities and principles that will become reflected in all of the main elite leading important institutions in the society. And so, you said you went to Oxford, and you can walk around Oxford today and you can see evidence of a predecessor civilization in every form, in its architecture, in its customs, in the names, right? Christ College and Jesus College and all the names of all these. I don't know if I was mentioning a Cambridge school. Apologies if I did.
Christchurch.
Yeah, Christchurch. Yeah. But I mean, there's so many of these institutions, Magdalen and so forth, that show and reveal a different dispensation. And now, while those sort of, you could say, the kind of palimpsest of those institutions remains, you can still see the writing under the surface. The surface writing tells us something very different, so that these institutions no longer do the same thing. They're the same buildings. They still have the same kind of organization. You have professors, you have students, but they now do something, and they attempt to produce a very different kind of human person with a very different, informed by a different philosophy, and ultimately a different, I think, theological horizon and metaphysics. So in the first instance, one reason we should have hope is that happened, which means that it's not necessarily permanent. It's not necessarily inevitable. Now, it may be, if you're a pessimist, you might think, well, since the predecessor tradition had certain virtues to it, if you're a Christian, perhaps this is a sign that everything is in decline. But nothing stays the same, as they say. I think Ecclesiastes has something along these lines. So it seems to me that one area where the classical tradition really does help us is to think about this ruling class. What are its principles? We have a ruling class today whose principles are, I think, reflect exactly what we've been talking about, reflect these liberal traditions, whether it's classical liberal or whether it's progressive liberal. But increasingly, of course, it's dominated by progressive liberals who have really established a kind of beachhead in the main institutions, the universities, the media, the kind of NGO world. They've established hegemony in those institutions. Here, I think the classical tradition teaches us, among other things, that a bad leadership class that's producing pathology after pathology will ultimately only be checked by the rising up of those people who are suffering under those conditions. And that would be the kind of, I think, evidence of that is in the kind of populist movement we see today, which is often not articulated very well. It's not well led, I would submit, but requires the development of a kind of new leadership class, a new elite that will replace not just the people, but will replace the philosophical, theological, metaphysical underpinnings of the current leadership class. So you need a simultaneously, I would say, it's a kind of sensitive dance in a way. You need, on the one hand, the kind of political force that wells from the bottom up. But unless that just either becomes easily dominated by a demagogue, or more likely than not, will run out of steam. And both of these things can happen. I think arguably have happened, certainly in the US. You need the development also of a leadership class that can, in some ways, develop in sympathy with this political movement, lead it, guide it, help it to articulate the best views that it's attempting to articulate, which I think are ultimately Aristotelian, which basically says that there should be flourishing of the citizenry that should occur and should be possible and available to human beings, regardless, or largely regardless, of their socioeconomic status. Not entirely ambivalent, not entirely indifferent to that, because we need certain conditions of prosperity, but that it shouldn't require, as it now does in a liberal society, that one be essentially wealthy to lead a flourishing life. It shouldn't require a certain kind of degree and then a life path to have a flourishing life, while those who don't benefit from those advantages increasingly are living lives of degradation and kind of various kinds of both not only monetary, economic impoverishment, but kind of, the impoverishment of their souls.
And just a final question: do you see any signs? I mean, I know you've hinted there that this kind of populist uprising is not necessarily being led as well as it could be. You talk a little bit about Trump in the book. do you see any signs that this kind of virtuous leadership class is, even in a kind of in a nucleic form, developing in the US or here in the UK?
I do think that more and more people are thinking about it and trying to help it develop. I mean, the difficulty, and this is, it's just built into the, I guess, baked into the cake, they would say. The difficulty, of course, is that the institutions most responsible for developing the leadership class, as I've mentioned, are run and dominated by the kind of liberal class. And so, as I put in the book has, it has its various appeals to Marxist analysis without arriving at Marxist conclusions, but you need traitors to their class, to use the classic Marxist term. You need people who are willing and capable of developing a kind of independence of thinking that recognizes the kind of fatal course of the ruling class today, and which works to turn more and more of the potential, those who will be in this ruling class, to turn them to a different vision of the human good. That said, I actually do think that probably the greatest mechanism won't be people reading my book. I hope that people will read the book, and a certain number of people will be sort of preparing the ground for this. But in all likelihood, the most likely trigger or mechanism for this is the simple unsustainability of the liberal project itself, and the growing and welling discontent of a kind of underclass. Now, here's where I do entertain some pessimistic thoughts and prospects, which is that even in the last couple of years, it seems that a kind of populist energy rose and is beginning to subside somewhat. There's been a reassertion of the main liberal parties, or let's just say the kind of those who are in charge of things, who I think were put back on their heel a little bit by Brexit and by Donald Trump, and have kind of reasserted themselves, at least institutionally. But maybe most of all is the worry that this liberal failure and success can continue for a long time. Precisely in some ways because of its technological ability to use advanced technologies to its advantages, and things we've mentioned include things like transhumanism, but also simply a kind of the power of distraction, the power of using these technologies and these entertainment, the media, to simply distract people from their misery. Right, a kind of, almost like the Matrix or something. People can be, essentially turned into batteries and given fantasy lives that will satiate them. And this is perhaps my greatest worry, concern, fear, is that the fact of our fallenness means that we do have these tendencies to be too easily undermined by sin, undermined by the ease and pleasure and distraction that the modern world offers us.
And hence why your book ends with, rather surprisingly, a discussion of prayer and the relationship of prayer to politics, which I think is so profound. And I'm so glad you said that, because I've been thinking along those lines recently. I mean, unless people put away their phones, and I mean, I know many people might be listening to this on a phone, but largely speaking, put your phone away and pray and develop a spiritual life. This is going to carry on. So it starts with us.
Yeah, it does. And here again, I think we can jawbone this. But one of the ways in which I end the book is saying that the opportunity to pray, and we could say the norm of praying, is something that we can be committed to as a social and political order. And again, that seems like anathema in the ears of many classical liberals. But among things, these are modest things in my view. They might seem as radical to the kind of classical liberal, but things like Sabbath laws and the reintroduction of scripture in public schools, or what would you call them? Public schools or private schools in England, right?
What is public when you pay or when you don't?
Yes, when you pay. When it's funded through taxation.
That would be state school. Yeah,
state school. Yeah, so we call them public, but the reintroduction of scripture in in state schools. I just think to begin to think of ways in which we can integrate what we might think of as a kind of the classical practices of Christian contemplation and that kind of Joseph Pieper understanding of leisure as the basis of culture. These are ideals that we should not be politically indifferent to. And so I end the book with just a kind of plaintive call in following with the argument of the book that prayer, or let's say this kind of contemplative virtues, are increasingly the domain of those who are best off in our society.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it was Steve Jobs, right, who didn't allow his children to use iPhones, because he understood. But why should it be the case that those who are less likely to understand the harms of these kinds of practices, why should it be that we don't extend to them the benefits of our understanding? So here a leadership class that has concern for the good of human beings and the possibilities and prospects of human flourishing cannot be indifferent to these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the thing you say about Oxford as well, and it's something that I was thinking about just yesterday. I live in Winchester, just down the road from Winchester College, which is the oldest school in the country. And you've got these beautiful Gothic buildings, so beautiful, and then right in the middle of the college, ugly modern buildings, disgusting buildings which make you feel sick. And you just have to think to yourself, like, what is the imagination that is producing this and then this, and which one of them is informed by something worthwhile, something valuable, something transcendent? It's just so clear, and it's exactly the same thing in the city of Oxford. So I'm captivated by that. I love the vision of a new Oxford. It's a wonderful thing, and I agree we need regime change to affect.
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned this conference with these students, and actually I put up a lot of pictures of exactly this, college campuses and the kind of the classical older buildings, even in the United States, which is a much younger country, but which designed its colleges and universities originally on the kind of Oxford Cambridge model, and then also built these horrendous buildings. And I said, and one of my arguments was that the modernist buildings were built out of a certain vision of freedom, to be free, especially of the limits of nature, right? To demonstrate the human power over nature, that we no longer had to sort of respect gravity and weather and the sort of demands to sort of demonstrate how windows and roofs are being held up. And hence why you get some of the most beautiful features of classical buildings are the way that you demonstrate a kind of human recognition and deference to nature. So arched windows and beautiful pillars and the pediments and so forth. These are all accentuations of the human deference to the natural order.
Yeah.
And I said the language of freedom is precisely in some ways what leads to those, the kind of the loss of or the abandonment of that kind of building to the kind of building that I think we are sadly familiar with. Yeah. And here I suggested that the language that's really needed is the language of order. The language really, which if you look at the Latin roots of the word order, it really is about, ultimately it connects to a theological understanding, right? Ordination, the order of priests and so forth. But that the word order is really about a right ordering of things. It's about it literally comes from its oldest usage was weaving, was a word that had something to do with weaving. It's a weaving together of the particular and the whole. It's taking particular things and weaving them into a whole. And I think as a political image, as a social image, as a theological image, we could do a lot worse than to be using the language of order, which ultimately has to reflect the created order itself.
Yeah, well, that's a lovely thought to finish on. I think that's a powerful critique of modern architecture. And there's so much more to be said on all of these things. But yeah. I know you need to go, but thank you so much for this book and for this vision, which I think is so important. And I do really recommend people go and buy this book. I'll just show it to the YouTube and video watchers. Regime Change Towards a Post-liberal Future. It's available on Amazon. Also, I really recommend Patrick's other book, Why Liberalism Failed. Really, really important books.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was wonderful to speak with you. Thanks.
Bye.